Hello everyone. So, let's talk about variation of techniques, and specifically we're going to be talking about variation of Unterhau. But first let's get into why you would have variations. So, pretty much every martial art has a couple variations from over the years integrated in with its normal techniques. Right? So for example, the Kodokan in Judo, the list of all the throws that Jigoro Kano wrote down. Now there are much more variations of each technique. So for example, Taitoshi. You have traditional Taitoshi, you have British Taitoshi, you have a sort of dropping Taitoshi, a narrow Taitoshi, Taitoshi with an over-the-back grip. You have a lot of different variations over time, and some of you have been named regionally. So for example, there's also Taitoshi with a Koga type step in, which is named after Koga sensei, who entered in a particular way. So the same thing happens in swordsmanship. We have all of the different masters that followed Lichtenauer put their own particular spins on some things. And now, while they didn't specifically refer to it usually as their variation of technique, these days we usually do. So that's going to come up a little bit later. For the Italians, however, with the rapier tradition, that actually comes up quite a lot. Alfieri, for example, goes into serious detail about his guardia mista, which is normally you'd have seconda, terza, quarta. Guardia mista is between quarta and terza, and he claims it's the most ideal thing that no one's ever thought of before. And it could have just been some, shameless self-advertising on Alfieri's part. I like Alfieri, but he's a bit of a git. Anyway, though, so why would you vary something? Why would you deviate from the norm? Well, there's a couple different reasons. Number one could be that you're finding yourself in a situation where, let's use the Unterhau for example, you're finding yourself in a situation where that is your best attack. But if you do it in the purely traditional way, it doesn't quite work. You need to do some variation in order to make what is your best option work even better. Because that's really the point of the thing, is to be able to apply all of these techniques in a bunch of varied situations without needing to, get stuck, overly think about it, etc. Because, of course, as we know, things don't always break down the exact same way as they do in the sources. They can, but not always. So, that's one reason you might vary the technique, is to better fit a particular situation that you're finding yourself in. Another option would be that you need to vary the technique because you can't quite do the traditional version. Now, can't quite do the traditional version is a bit of a interesting term to walk along, so let's talk about that. So, and this is actually something that I struggle with myself when I do judo, because I'm 6'4", and that can make some techniques kind of hard. But I'm gonna keep trying anyway, though. So, if you can't do the traditional, it could be because you're not practiced in it enough, which is fine, but you do need something in the meantime, and that kind of development will happen naturally as you work toward your ideal. You come up with other ways to still get the job done, and this is pretty much always in a sparring context, not in a working out of the source context. Or alternatively, you have a physical limitation that prevents you from doing the technique in the traditional way. In the case of the Unterhau, which is actually why I'm making this video, I have a very good friend of mine who has a shoulder injury, and he follows along with the videos. Hey. And doing the Unterhau in the full traditional way causes him pain. I would advocate for him not to have to do that, because it's not worth it. Now, alternatively, you could be varying the technique because you're known for a certain version of it, and you're looking to add a little bit of twist to it. And I'll go more into detail on that, but that is another reason I'm making this video, which is one of my students who is also tall, like me. I am trying to get him to fight from below, because as a tall person, most people don't expect cuts to rise from below. I'm just giving away my secret, don't tell anyone, shh. But fighting from below as a tall person is super, super useful and is a very good thing to cultivate. Now, I'll probably go into detail more on that in another video when I do one on fighting as a tall person, or conversely, fighting as a short person. But anyway, so let's talk about variations of Unterhaus. And they do appear in the sources as well. Usually the Unterhau is not depicted with a ton of detail, same with the Ober and the Mittel, because it's pretty self-explanatory. But because it's so self-explanatory, it could be another reason we get these variations. It's a regional thing. Everyone does it a little differently. Anyway, though, so your normal Unterhau, you're going to come down into a position that points your tip backwards. So, for example, I go from Vamtag down to Nebenhut, and I'm going to use both of my arms extending as my core turns and I step, which will put me up into Ox. It can happen on both sides, and there shouldn't be all that much difference between the two. Now, advantages of doing this particular Unterhau, which I have shown in the past. Your advantages are that it can be very, very strong when you get into that Ox position, especially if you can deal with their blade coming down. So if they are doing an Oberhau at you, you can pop into an Unterhau and rather easily lock them up. Once you're into a good formed Ox, there's not much that can get through this shape. Couple this with a decently wide offline step or a crossline step, which I'll show in a moment, and you're pretty safe. Drawback is that you do have to turn your tip backwards to launch this technique in this way. Not saying that you couldn't, with practice, get it a little bit tighter, but you do have to bring your tip out of presence. It just always happens. It also requires a decent set of coordination and amount of balance. But that's true of all techniques. So, other drawback is if you're fighting someone who has the tendency to just Mittelhau on reflex, don't go for this one. Or if you do, be very ready to drop down into Flug to deal with their follow-up action, which at that point, since you know they're going to just twitch off, probably better to go for a different technique or bait them into this from the get-go. But let's go into more detail about this particular Unterhau. So here I am on this line. I hope I've backed up far enough for you to see it. When I launch my Unterhau, I'm going to start off in Nebenhut. I am going to step wide with an oblique step out. So that way, when I compass in, my point is in line with what I was fighting, but I am well to the side. My arms are out and extended like I was doing a push-up. Both of my hands are underneath the sword, not curled like this. And my tip and my blade is at a 45-degree angle. This ensures that I'm nice and strong and can meet any incoming force. So here's that again. Vamtag, Nebenhut, nice step. Conversely, on the other side, same thing, a little easier because your arms are crossed, but we'll come back to that again in a moment. Now make sure that you are keeping your torso upright and not overly leaning into this. You will see some depictions, especially from Meyer, where they have that slight lean to them when they're cutting out, but that's more of once again, a regional thing. They're doing their footwork in a very specific way, and for a beginner, I'd not recommend trying to mimic those. I'd instead work on keeping your torso upright, building up your core, and eventually building up those hip flexors to be able to do that with stability. Because really, I just want to make sure that people can do this art without breaking themselves. But that's one version of the Unterhau, and that one is a pretty good one, especially if you can start combining it with other things. So, you pop up into Ox, they run away, you turn the hands over, you have an Oberhau there. You pop up into Ox, they meet your pressure push, there's a Zwerk. You pop up into Ox, you can also come back down with a short edge, you can deliver the thrust. If they try to cut the other side, you can transition Oxes. It is a very, very good position. And it's a good cut to get there. If you've been doing a lot of sword and buckler, or seen my sword and buckler vid, you can also use the Unterhau to then lead into a duplier, and it still works with longsword. But, like I said, that's kind of your bog standard Unterhau, and is probably one of the reasons I expect that a lot of people don't do Unterhaus, is because they don't want to try and use that big of a motion a lot of the time when they could do something different. So, let's look at the more common Unterhau that you see used in competition, which is still an Unterhau, even though most people don't think it looks like one, which is the slashing. So what is the slashing? The slashing is when you do a short edge Unterhau, one of those numbers, or one of these numbers. Now, according to Jake Norwood's interpretation of the Kollner Effect book, at least how he sees it, which is the Kollner Effect book is a contemporary of Liechtenauer. I have a video up on it that goes into a little more detail. That is from the common fencer's perspective, so not Liechtenauer's tradition. This was their preferred Unterhau. probably because it's simpler to do, and anyone out there who's a teacher will know when you describe someone cut from below, about 8 times out of 10, they're going to cut with the back edge without thinking about it. And it is a very good cut. The reason that you see it the most is because this cut, specifically if you launch it out of here, that's how you take hands. And you can take hands very, very quickly with a little bit of lever action. It's a very, very good technique. However, advantage is speed, and it's decently difficult to parry if you don't see it coming. Disadvantage is you do not cover yourself in any way. So, let's look at some variations of that make it a little bit safer, / give us the, pun intended, also give us the opportunity to do other things. So, for example, normally people pop the slash out like this. They're going to just tag the hands and then run away. However, we can also use it as a hard goring action, as depicted from Ring X plays from the Namenhut, or alternatively, Fiore's plays from Dente de Chingaro, which is the boar's tooth. So for this, I'm stepping out with my left foot as I gore forward, targeting into the ribs, the hands, or into the face. This allows me, the only way for them to parry this and prevent my tip from getting them is to go into fluid, which then I can work around their sword. So it's essentially the same thing as doing that and forcing them to parry, them working around it. But, well, more like the Shidetsu. But anyway, so that's one attack that's super, super interesting, and I'm trying to play with it more and more. Another way that you can do it, of course, is to do the straight up Wechselhau. So with the Wechselhau, I'm going to bait someone into attacking me, pop, and then turn and follow up with whatever cut I would like. That is another short edge Unterhau. So that's another great one. And you can combine them pretty well with Oberhaus or even Unterhaus. So I can go, for example, short, long. So deflect the sword / attack the hands. Follow up with another long edge Unterhau, which we'll go into detail on that Unterhau in a minute. I could alternatively short, long, then come back into distance. You can do this with some footwork. I can gather up, then extend out. And anytime you catch the blade of their hands, you can just follow it forward with a thrust. But that's all great, grand, and wonderful. Let's talk about a less done Unterhau. So a variation, first off, on the extended Unterhau, which I just did, which is the wrist cut version. So if you've seen my video on grip, you know that more often than not we see the sword held in this way, not this way, and this way sometimes, but this way. When you have your hands loose like this and you let the sword move, you can then execute wrist cuts with more structure. So what is a wrist cut? You have 3 planes of cutting. You can cut from your shoulder, you can cut from your elbow, you can cut from your wrist. So wrist, elbow, shoulder. Small, medium, big. Now, you don't want to do elbow cuts most of the time with at least one-handed sword or too often because that'll give you tennis elbow. The joint wears down very quickly. Wrist cuts are awesome, but pretty weak. Shoulder cuts are awesome, but they're pretty slow. So really it's a mix between the two, and you can mix the two. So I start the cut with my shoulder, finish it with my wrist. I start the cut with my wrist, finish it with my shoulder. So when they blend together, they cover each other's weakness. So let's talk about the short edge Unterhau. Sorry, not short edge Unterhau, the wrist cut Unterhau. So where this is best launched is from an extended position. So for example, I cut out and they meet my pressure. Now, at this point what we'd be expecting is for me to come around with an Oberhau abnehmen. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide back, push on my pommel, turn my hands over so my edge is turning toward me. I'm going to then pull on my pommel and execute an Unterhau with just my wrists. So here's that slowly again. Back, out. Back, out. And this can be done on both sides, so I can also do it here, there. Now that one is going to be a little harder to do because your hands aren't crossing. When your hands cross, they become stronger because they lock into a position, so you don't have to work as hard. The uncrossed version, you're going to need to use a little more footwork. So for example, I'm here, I go to follow up, I'll step about there comfortably. This one I'll be stepping out here like before, a big offline step to put my hand to that nice strong ox. But where this is particularly good is people expect you to cut from above, instead you deliver a cut from below. Another version that you can do with it, and that you can also do with the shoulder Unterhau, is the cross line pass. So what that looks like is here I am. Rather than stepping away from the line, and I'm going to go ahead and do it with the wrist cut, I am instead going to step across the line. So you'll notice that my toe is still facing toward what I'm fighting, just like my tip. My hands are still on the side of my back foot, and I'm in this nice balanced position. Don't do this. This, one, it's already hard to maintain my balance when I'm facing that. It's taking my core away from what I'm fighting, and also it's going to lead to a bad habit of retreat. So if I go like this, I'm more inclined to go forward on my next action. If I go like this, I'm more inclined to just go that way, which leads to that kind of nonsense, which one, that can be a penalty, is turning the back of the head. Two, don't turn the back of your head because if I hit you there, your eyeballs are going to turn off. Personal experience there. Three, how are you going to parry anything this way? You can do the ponytail protect and really hope, but it doesn't work most times. So, that's another variation you can do with it, is the cross-line step. And the cross-line step works both ways. So I can also step with my left foot across as I do the cross hands version. But anyway, so that's how to do the wrist cut. Now let's look at another variation of this, which is, I call it the kurz Unterhau, so the short Unterhau. And apologies if my German is not too great when it comes to improvising my own words. But anyway, this one closely mimics what Talhofer depicts when he shows the Unterhau. So I'll get you that book. So Talhofer shows us, setting my sword down, Talhofer shows us this plate, right? We have Oberhau, and we have Unterhau. Now this does not look like our standard Unterhau. He has his other foot forward, so he's got his left foot forward at the moment, and he's also got his arms down here, doing this kind of shape. Now, I have a couple interpretations of how you get to this position. Number one is that he's doing the Unterhau without stepping. So I'll go ahead and stand in the same plane as him relatively, except I'll have my other hand forward. So here he is, and he's in left foot forward. When the cut comes in, he's instead going to drop his tip back and then cut from here, which allows him to intercept the blade. Second option is that he is doing a step, but he's doing a step with his other foot. So he could be doing it out of a position like, for example, Albert or Flug or Nebenhut, and coming forward with this cut, which forms that shape. Now, what this cut allows you to do is it's very, very quick, and it allows you to add in a little bit more binding than normally your short edge Unterhau would give you, but this one has more speed than the long edge Unterhau. And this is actually a cut that I use a lot, but I vary it a little bit. So let's talk about the fine points of how to form that cut. So what you're going to do, once again, make sure you have a nice loose grip, is you're going to turn your edge over, and I'm going to keep my elbows slightly bent, and I'm going to pull with this hand as I raise with this hand up so that the tip gets the most acceleration to it. What this can allow you to do is if you do it against the blade, you now meet it in this bind, and you can pop your short edge back in, but it's not going to be as strong as a regular ox. Where I use this most times is I do a little tricky combo I came up with, which is I'll go into a very narrow Schrankut. Also, I'll refer to this as long edge Alber, and then I'll step out to the side rather than forward with my left foot. So let's look at what that looks like. So, I'll stand usually right foot forward to do this. I can do it left foot forward, but usually I'll be right foot forward. And what I'll do from here is I'll either be in Alber, I'll be in a narrow Schrankut. So normally Schrankut is going to be out like this. I'll be more narrow down here. Or I'll even slightly back weight myself, and I've turned my sword over. So normally Alber's here. I've turned my sword all the way over, so now my thumb is on the side. My long edge is facing up. My hands are very much underneath my sword. And as the cut comes in, or as I see a high guard that I think I can fit under, I'm going to step out to the side with my left foot as I do a small, simple step with my right foot. At the same time, I am going to pull on the pommel upward and deliver that cut. Now, my cut can vary, because I can also do a good, strong, normal shoulder Unterhau from here, though it doesn't require the same shoulder motion. It's more an extension. So here's that from the side. Very, very good, because it allows me to then pop into that guard from that position. Alternatively, I'll let my elbows bend a little bit to get a bit more tip acceleration. This is usually how I'll take the hands versus the other one is if I'm going for the deeper body. So here's what that one looks like. Well, first at the front, then from the side. So I'm here, there, here, there. Now, it leaves you in this position, which is not actually a guard. But if I meet upon the blade, I can then step forward having bound. If I meet upon the blade, I can also deliver a quick short edge. If they parry hard against my sword, flow it through and cut. It only really works going from my right to my left. I've tried it from my left to the right. Maybe I need more practice on it, but I just haven't had the same success. However, I'm going to see fighting against a left-hander if that perhaps is an aspect of it. Otherwise, though, that's pretty much all of the variations of Unterhau that I wanted to cover. A little bit of a rambly video, a little bit of a slower video, but I wanted to go into more detail about things. So hopefully that's of help for people out there. If you want me to go into more detail about any of the four I showed, that being the traditional Unterhau, the slashing / short edge Unterhau, the wrist cut Unterhau, or the Kurz Unterhau, I'm going to just keep with that name. If you want me to go into way more detail about any of those, feel free to ask. But otherwise, thank you guys very much for watching, and I hope that was helpful. We'll talk about some other techniques another time.